I didn't start this investigation believing marble could be moulded like clay. That's absurd. Everyone knows marble is carved, chiseled, beaten into submission by patient hands over months or years. Michelangelo himself supposedly spent 4 years on David. The narrative is settled, documented, taught in every art history course across the world. But then I look closer at the veins, not the marble veins, the human ones, the bulging, anatomically perfect veins of stone. The translucent draping reveals the body beneath, the fingers of sinking into flesh as if the marble were actual flesh, the lace veils carved from a single block yet appearing weightless, gossamer, impossible. Ask yourself, how do you carve negative space beneath a surface? How do you create the illusion of depth in a material that has no give, no flexibility, no margin for error? How do you make solid stone appear transparent? You make one mistake with a chisel, one miscalculation, and the entire sculpture is ruined. The vein becomes a groove, the illusion shatters, yet we see no hesitation, no correction, no evidence of trial and error, just perfection. Anatomical, medical, impossible perfection. And that's where the official explanation begins to collapse. I started cataloguing examples, not selectively, not cherry-picking, but systematically. What I found wasn't occasional brilliance or rare genius. I found a pattern that spanned continents and centuries, a consistency that shouldn't exist if we're talking about individual artists working independently with hammers and chisels. Bernini's statue of Proserpina. Look at Pluto's fingers pressing into Proserpina's marble thigh, not resting on the surface, pressing into it. The flesh dimples, it compresses. It behaves exactly as soft tissue behaves under pressure. The marble appears to yield, to deform, to respond to force the way living flesh responds. How? How do you carve displacement? How do you calculate the exact geometry of compressed tissue and then reproduce it in an unforgiving medium that allows no revision? One wrong tap and you've removed too much material. The dimple becomes a crater. The illusion fails, but it doesn't fail. Not in Proserpina, not in Apollo and Daphne, where Bernini transforms marble into bark mid-metamorphosis, where you can see individual leaves emerging from fingertips with botanical accuracy. Not in the veiled Christ in Naples, where marble becomes fabric so convincing that visitors instinctively reach out to lift the veil. The veiled Christ. That's where the mystery becomes impossible to ignore. Giuseppe San Martino carved, or allegedly carved, the veiled Christ in 1753. The sculpture depicts Christ's body covered by a translucent shroud, except the shroud isn't separate. It's part of the same block of marble as the body beneath, one continuous piece. And yet, you can see Christ's face through the veil, not suggested, not implied, visible. The nose, the closed eyes, the parted lips. The fabric clings to the contours of the body with gravitational accuracy, draping over the chest, pooling in the hollow of the throat, pulling taut across the knees. The folds obey physics. The transparency varies depending on thickness. Where the fabric bunches, it becomes opaque. Where it stretches thin, the body shows through. This raises a simple but critical question. How do you carve through something that doesn't exist? The veil isn't real. It's solid marble pretending to be gossamer fabric. To create the illusion of seeing through it, you need to calculate not just the surface of the veil, but the surface of the body beneath, and then somehow remove marble in such precise amounts that the eye perceives depth, transparency, layering. Have you noticed any peculiar statues in your city or during your own research? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. The mathematics alone seem impossible for the 18th century, but more troubling is the physical execution. Because to carve the depression where the veil dips into Christ's open mouth, you need to reach through the veil that hasn't been carved yet. You need to work backward and forward simultaneously. You need to remove material that's both in front of and behind other material in a sequence that defies linear process, unless you're not carving at all. But there were those who searched, investigators who couldn't accept the impossible veils and compressed flesh as mere artistic genius. Colonel Percy Fawcett documented stories of a liquid that could soften stone to the consistency of clay. Explorer Hiram Bingham, who rediscovered Machu Picchu, heard the same accounts from indigenous sources. In 1983, a Catholic priest claimed he'd successfully softened stones using plant extracts but couldn't resolve the rehardening problem. The plant's name surfaces repeatedly. Jocha pito, scientifically classified as Ephedra andina. Researchers Jan Peter de Jong, Christopher Jordan and Jesus Gamarra examined Cusco's granite walls and found evidence of vitrification, surfaces heated to extreme temperatures and turned glassy. Engineer Christopher Dunn analysed Egyptian monuments and documented precision that modern tools struggle to replicate. Marcel Fauti investigated the scoop marks at Aswan, comparing ancient capabilities to modern stoneworking. Multiple researchers, multiple continents, multiple decades, all arriving at the same forbidden conclusion: the official explanation doesn't work. And here's the strangest part: their work never gained traction. No universities funded follow-up studies, no institutions replicated experiments. The 1983 documentary aired once and vanished. Fawcett's accounts were filed away as explorer folklore. Dunn's precision measurements were acknowledged but not investigated. The pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. Those who investigate too deeply either stop publishing, shift to safer topics, or watch their work dismissed as fringe speculation. The questions remain officially unanswered. The research remains unfunded. The mystery remains conveniently unsolved. I began examining the tools supposedly used for these sculptures: chisels, hammers, rasps, drills for pilot holes, abrasives for polishing, the same basic toolkit available to sculptors for thousands of years. And here's the strangest part: the technology barely changed between ancient Rome and the Renaissance. The tools Michelangelo used were functionally identical to those used by Roman sculptors 1,500 years earlier. Same materials, same methods, same limitations. Yet the complexity of the sculpture increased exponentially. Roman portrait busts were impressive for their time, accurate, detailed, recognizably human. But compare them to Bernini's Apollo and Daphne. Compare static faces to fingers transforming into laurel branches while maintaining perfect anatomical structure at every stage of metamorphosis. Compare simplified drapery to fabric so convincing you can identify the weave pattern. The gap isn't incremental. It's not the result of gradual improvement or artistic evolution. It's categorical. It's the difference between competent and impossible. When you examine the progression, when you track the timeline, you notice something disturbing. The greatest sculptural achievements cluster in specific periods and locations: Renaissance Italy, Baroque Rome, and before that, scattered examples throughout the classical world: the Laocoon group, the Nike of Samothrace, works that seem to exist outside their technological context. It's as if the knowledge came and went, as if it was inherited rather than invented. The pattern doesn't stay confined to Italy. That's what makes this impossible to dismiss as regional genius or artistic school. I found similar impossible details in the Taj Mahal's marble screens, Jali work so intricate that solid marble becomes geometric lace, with some perforations less than a millimetre thick. One miscalculation and the entire panel shatters. The Temple of Luxor in Egypt, where hieroglyphs cut into granite, not soft limestone but granite, maintain crisp edges and perfect depth across surfaces spanning hundreds of feet. Chinese Buddhist grottos in Longmen, where thousands of figures emerge from cliff faces with identical proportions and anatomical precision, as if stamped rather than individually carved. The Kailasa temple, not built upward but carved downward from a single rock outcrop, removed 400,000 tons of stone to create a structure with load-bearing pillars, intricate reliefs, and structural calculations that would challenge modern engineers. Different continents, different cultures, different time periods, same impossible precision. The official explanation: parallel development, independent artistic achievement, human ingenuity solving similar problems in similar ways. But that explanation collapses when you examine the specifics, because we're not talking about similar solutions, we're talking about identical techniques producing identical results using supposedly identical tools across civilizations that had no contact with each other. The consistency is unnerving. If you're beginning to see the pattern, if these questions resonate, consider subscribing to stay updated as we investigate what history has forgotten. And here's where the silence becomes deafening. When you trace back the origins of these impossible sculptures, when you examine the architectural context they emerge from, you find something unexpected. They appear during periods of radical construction, during eras when entire cities were supposedly built in decades using primitive tools and manpower. The same periods when vast networks of identically designed buildings appeared across continents, when civic structures of extraordinary complexity materialized without adequate documentation of their construction. When the official narrative asks us to believe in coincidence on a global scale, the structures that hint at advanced architectural knowledge, the buildings that seem inherited rather than invented, the infrastructure that appears complete rather than evolutionary, the world that some researchers have begun calling Tartaria, not as a specific empire, the evidence is too fragmentary for that, but as a placeholder for something we've lost, a previous iteration of civilization, a global culture with technological capabilities we no longer possess. The marble sculptures fit this pattern. They represent a zenith of technique that appeared suddenly, flourished briefly, and then declined. The knowledge didn't gradually develop, it was there, complete, and then it faded. By the 19th century, sculptors were already struggling to replicate the effects of Bernini and Michelangelo. The techniques were being lost in real time. By the 20th century, they were gone entirely. Modern sculptors work in the shadow of achievements they can't reproduce. We're told this is normal. Artistic knowledge is fragile. Techniques are forgotten. Masters die without fully training apprentices. But this many techniques, this completely, with no written records, no preserved methods, no intermediate steps showing decline. The pattern suggests something more deliberate, a discontinuity, an erasure. I searched for documentation, detailed accounts of how these sculptures were created, artist journals describing their methods, workshop records showing time expenditure, tool usage, material costs. What I found was silence. Michelangelo left behind sonnets, letters, contract disputes, but virtually nothing about his actual sculpting technique. We have more documentation of Renaissance painters mixing pigments than we do of sculptors working marble. Bernini's workshop produced masterpiece after masterpiece, yet we have no detailed account of his process. No apprentice wrote a comprehensive manual. No patron commissioned a documentation of technique. It's as if the methods were deliberately not recorded, or as if the records were removed. When you examine institutional archives, art historical records, museum documentation, you find the same pattern: description but no explanation, admiration but no instruction, wonder but no understanding. The establishment acknowledges the mystery: marble that appears soft, veils that seem real, anatomical precision that defies logic, but then moves past it, as if the impossibility is less important than maintaining the narrative. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The gap between what these sculptures demonstrate and what our historical timeline allows. the consistency of technique across impossible distances, the sudden appearance and equally sudden disappearance of capabilities that surpass what we can achieve today with powered tools and computer modelling. But here's what makes this more than speculation. The sculptures still exist. They're not theoretical. They're not legend. They're physical objects you can examine, measure, analyse. And when modern materials scientists study them, not art historians but engineers and chemists, they find anomalies. Certain sections of marble showing different crystalline structures than the surrounding stone, as if they were formed under different conditions, or reformed. Microscopic analysis revealing organic compounds integrated into the marble matrix at the molecular level, not on the surface, within the stone itself. Tool marks that don't match any known chisel pattern. Surfaces polished to tolerances that require sustained pressure and heat that hand tools cannot generate. None of this proves moulding definitively, but it raises questions that the official explanation cannot answer. Why would marble contain organic compounds unless something organic was mixed with it during formation? Why would crystalline structures vary within a single sculpture unless different sections underwent different processes? Why would tool marks be inconsistent with documented tools unless different tools or different methods were used? And we haven't even addressed the scale problem. Some of these sculptures are enormous. The Trevi Fountain, the Fountain of the Four Rivers, installations requiring multiple figures, all with the same impossible details, all completed in timeframes that seem absurd. Bernini supposedly created the Four Rivers Fountain in under 2 years. 4 massive figures, dozens of animals, intricate rockwork, water engineering, architectural integration, all while maintaining the quality that makes individual fingers pressing into stone look soft. 2 years, with hand tools, with marble that fractures unpredictably, with no room for error. Or you have the Apollo and Daphne, which Bernini completed in 3 years while simultaneously working on other commissions. A sculpture showing 2 figures in motion, with Daphne's fingers becoming leaves, bark spreading across her skin, her hair transforming into branches, and Apollo's hand touching skin that's in the process of becoming wood. The transition zones alone should be impossible. The areas where human flesh becomes tree bark, where the material properties would be shifting, where a chisel would encounter changing resistance. Unless the material was uniform when worked, unless it was all equally soft, equally mouldable, equally responsive. By 1800 the capability was declining. By 1900 it was effectively gone. Modern sculptors can create impressive work, beautiful, technically accomplished, worthy of admiration, but they cannot create veils that appear transparent. They cannot create flesh that appears compressed. They cannot create veins that bulge beneath marble skin. The techniques didn't evolve into something else. They didn't transform into modern methods. They simply stopped. And the establishment explanation? Changing artistic tastes. The rise of new movements, economic factors making marble work less viable. But taste doesn't eliminate capability. Fashion doesn't erase technique. Economics don't make knowledge vanish. What makes knowledge vanish is deliberate suppression, institutional control of information, the systematic removal of inconvenient evidence. When you realize how much architectural and technological knowledge disappeared in the same period, atmospheric engines, hydraulic systems, construction methods that produce buildings we can't replicate today, the marble techniques fit a larger pattern. A pattern of inheritance followed by loss, of capabilities that shouldn't exist in their historical context, of evidence that suggests we're living in the aftermath of something greater. The most unsettling aspect isn't what we don't know, it's that no one seems to be asking. Art historians marvel at these sculptures but don't demand technical explanations. Engineers recognize impossibilities but don't challenge the official timeline. Institutions preserve the works while avoiding the questions they raise. It's a collective agreement not to look too closely, not to ask how, not to examine the gap between capability and explanation. Because once you start asking, Once you follow the evidence where it leads, you arrive at conclusions that destabilize everything. You arrive at the possibility that we're wrong about our own history, that the timeline is compressed, distorted, or deliberately falsified, that previous civilizations achieved things we're only now beginning to understand, that the sculptures weren't carved, they were molded, or formed through processes we can no longer comprehend, that the knowledge was inherited from something that came before, something that left traces worldwide, something we've been taught never existed. So I return to where I started, to Moses' arm, to those impossible veins. I don't have definitive answers. I have questions that compound rather than resolve, patterns that repeat too consistently to dismiss, evidence that the official explanation cannot accommodate. I have sculptures that shouldn't exist if our understanding of history is correct, capabilities that appeared without precedent and disappeared without explanation, a worldwide consistency that suggests coordination on a scale that's difficult to accept. And I have the uncomfortable awareness that we might be living in the ruins of something we don't remember. That the masterpieces we preserve might be echoes of techniques we've forgotten. That what we call the pinnacle of human achievement might actually be the remnants of something far greater. The sculptures remain. Silent, perfect, impossible. Waiting for us to ask the right questions, not who carved them or when were they made or what do they represent, but how were they actually created? Why can't we replicate them today with superior technology? What knowledge was lost? And why was it lost so completely, so thoroughly, that we've stopped believing it ever existed? Ask yourself, if the official explanation is true, why can't modern sculptors with diamond-tipped tools, computer modelling and unlimited resources create a veil as convincing as San Martino's? Why can't they make marble look as soft as Bernini did? Why have we regressed? And when you realise we can't answer that question without admitting we've lost something fundamental, when you understand that these sculptures represent capabilities we no longer possess, you begin to see the real mystery. Not how were they made, but what else did we forget?